So, most people don't even realize that long before Plato ever walked the lecture halls of Athens teaching his students about the story of Atlantis, there really was a powerful and sophisticated civilization located on an island that ruled the seas of the ancient world that was destroyed by a cataclysmic volcanic eruption that caused tidal waves, blackened the sky for days, completely buried a city in ash, with the ensuing chaos resulting in the burnings of at least dozens of cities and towns, causing one of the ancient world's most advanced, powerful, and wealthy civilizations to eventually slip into obscurity and disappear completely, only surviving in shrouded legends and myths. This was a civilization of around 50 to 60 cities, complete with opulent palaces, massive naval and trading ships, ports, public architecture, elaborate, wealthy, and spacious private homes, anti-seismic architecture, 2 to 4 story buildings, plumbing and pressurized water systems to bring fresh water to the palaces and homes of the city's inhabitants, dedicated rooms for bathing, some of the finest architectural, art, and fashion styles found anywhere in the ancient world, and a written language that is still not completely deciphered. And yet, today, most people have not even heard of this civilization. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer and an anthropologist, and this is Bronze Age Atlantis, the buried city of Akrotiri. So, during the construction of Egypt's Suez Canal in the 1860s, engineers required vast amounts of a specific water-resistant cement. And on the island of Santorini, they found this water-resistant material called Theraic earth, Theraic being named after the island's original Greek name, Thera. Across the island were big, thick blankets of old ash and pumice, indicating that this island was once a volcano that had erupted sometime in the distant past. As the quarrymen worked at stripping away the volcanic material to use for the canal in Egypt, they began striking at something unexpected: stone blocks. This wasn't the bedrock or shrapnel from the volcano's eruption. These were stone blocks, stacked together in uniform, clearly man-made. Alongside these stone blocks were pottery shards and even preserved stores of agricultural goods. By 1866, a French archaeologist by the name of Ferdinand Fouquet had arrived on Santorini to study the volcano along with the ancient ruins discovered beneath the ash and pumice. By the end of his work on Santorini, it was clear that a highly developed city had existed on the island at some unknown point in the ancient past and clearly had been buried when the island's volcano erupted. In the following decades, archaeological investigations carried out by a man named Sir Arthur Evans would discover and excavate a colossal and elaborate palace city on the northern shore of the island of Crete. The ruins of the ancient city would become known as Knossos, and Sir Arthur Evans would name his newly found ancient people the Minoans, after the legendary Cretan king Minos spoken about throughout classical Greek mythology. And despite over 100 years of consistent archaeological work being done in the Minoan world, we still know very little about these people. Unlike nearly every single other ancient civilization, there is no obvious reference to a king or a ruler found anywhere in the art we've uncovered. There is even some evidence that they may have not had a king or a ruler at all, that they were capable of some other type of government long before that was ever thought possible. We don't know what language they spoke or how to read their script. We have almost no idea what their religious beliefs were. We see recurring motifs in their art and the visual representation of ethereal ideas being expressed, but we cannot interpret those beliefs beyond that. We see many depictions of bulls, double-bladed axes, birds, snakes, flowers, but we know none of what the Minoans believed of these aspects of their world. We don't know where the Minoans came from or how they arrived on Crete. We don't fully understand how they even came into power in the Mediterranean and the intricacies of how they accumulated their wealth and connections to other great ancient civilizations like the Egyptians, even being featured countless times on Egyptian walls during sacred processions and international festivals. We also have no idea if the Minoan world was even a unified region. They seemingly shared the vast majority of the iconic Minoan culture, but if looking at classical Greece is any indication, sharing a culture doesn't necessarily mean being part of a unified region. It's possible that the various Minoan palaces and their surrounding residential and agricultural areas were each their own independent city-state, taking part in the greater Minoan world. And the Minoan world is centered upon the southernmost island of modern-day Greece, known as Crete. Crete is a large island, about 160 miles across, situated perfectly on the northern side of the eastern Mediterranean, perfect for trade and naval supremacy. Crete was first inhabited by Neolithic cultures who would later evolve into the Minoans sometime around 6000 to 7000 BC, and it seems as though these Neolithic hunters and farmers officially transformed into what we can recognize as Minoan culture sometime around 3100 BC, coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, in the exact same century as the emergence of dynastic Egyptian culture. Okay, let's be honest, the cost of living isn't just high, it's exhausting. If you've been leaning on credit cards lately just to cover basic costs like groceries, gas, and utility bills, you're essentially paying a survival tax of 20% interest or more. Why keep handing your hard-earned paychecks to the bank when you could be keeping it for your family? My friends at American Financing have a better way. They're helping homeowners tap into their equity to pay off high-interest debt, with mortgage rates currently in the 5s. And on average, American Financing is saving their customers $800 a month. That's nearly $10,000 a year right back in your pocket. So it's not just a loan, it's a total financial reset. It takes just 10 minutes to find out what you could save. There are no upfront fees and no obligation to talk to a salary-based mortgage consultant. And here's the kicker. Start today and you could even delay 2 mortgage payments. American Financing, America's home for home loans. 866-889-5022. That's 866-889-5022 or americanfinancing.net/Luke. Thank you to American Financing for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the show. The Minoan world is then broken into 4 distinct phases between 3100 BC and 1100 BC, this latter date being coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, synonymous with the mysterious Bronze Age collapse, where nearly every predominant civilization around the eastern Mediterranean collapsed in a manner that is still unexplained. So here's the timeline of Minoan Civilization's 2,000-year reign. It begins with the pre-Palatial period. This is early Minoan. We're talking 3100 to 1900 BC. This is the growth of settlements, early trade, and craftsmanship, the very beginning of the Minoan world, where we can first see the earliest signs of their culture coming into existence. Then we move on to the second period, the Proto-Palatial period, or known as the Old Palace period. This is from 1900 to 1700. This is when the construction of the first major palaces began, probably when the Minoans were finally able to use all of this wealth that they'd been accumulating for centuries leading up to this point. The third era is known as Neo-Palatial, or the New Palace period. This goes from 1700 to around 1450 BC. This is their peak prosperity, where they rebuild the old palaces and expand them. This is the height of Minoan civilization, the peak of their wealth, the peak of their power. During this era is the Bronze Age Atlantis. Then we come into the post-Palatial period, our fourth era. This goes from around 1450 BC to about 1100 BC, or in other words, the same century as the collapse of the Bronze Age. Now, Minoan eras are named after their palaces because the Minoan palaces are essentially the defining feature of their civilization. They encompass the wealth and opulence of this lost culture. The most famous palaces are Knossos, which is the largest of the known palaces, containing over 1,300 rooms, multi-story buildings up to 3 to 4 floors, which is basically unheard of around 1700 BC. Most people visiting these palaces from elsewhere around the ancient world would be completely shocked that buildings like this were even possible to construct. And the other famous palaces are Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. But that's really just to name a few of them. These palaces featured unparalleled engineering in the ancient world, engineering that would not be achieved again until the rise of the Roman Empire 2,000 years later. They included sophisticated drainage and plumbing systems for both private residential areas and for the public. So your average citizen had, built for them by the city, convenient and luxurious public freshwater access, as well as access to flushing toilets found on all floors of the palaces. The palaces also included enormous and numerous light wells for ventilation and lighting throughout all floors of the buildings, and surrounding the buildings were paved courtyards complete with elaborate gardens and storage houses for the goods harvested in the countryside surrounding the palaces. It's very possible that the palaces themselves were not built exclusively and reserved for a noble-like class of Minoans, but rather the palace was a shared space or public architecture for all the residents of the area to gather and meet, though that is still a widely debated idea. Their palaces were also not walled, meaning that they didn't have fortified walls surrounding the palace, indicating that they had no fear of invasion, at least by land. Likely, they were relying on their naval superiority to keep their island oasis safe from outside invasions. We also find additional residential structures throughout the countryside, away from the palaces. These residences are more grand and larger than the vast majority of homes throughout the Mediterranean world. Everything about the Minoan world points to the fact that while they didn't have pyramids or enormous temples like you'd find in Egypt, the quality of life for a wealthy, average, or poor Minoan could very well have been noticeably or even far superior to anywhere else in the ancient world. It may come as a surprise to you, but we actually know more about the daily life of a normal person living in the Minoan world of this Bronze Age Atlantis than we do about the actual structure of Minoan society itself, which is really the complete inverse of most ancient civilizations, whereas in Egypt, we know quite a lot about the pharaohs and quite not a lot about the Egyptian commoners or the peasants or the middle-class people, which makes the Minoans a very, very, very unique ancient civilization to study. And the fact that we know so much about the Minoan commoner, well, that probably indicates to us that Minoan commoners were much more wealthy and had much more freedom than most people in the ancient world. Because of this ample amount of evidence, we're able to recreate and imagine what Minoan life was like from the physical archaeological remains excavated from their palaces, residential areas, farms, ports, and even caves that they used for offerings and cult practices. Most of the remains of the Minoan world come from the Neopalatial period between 1700 and 1450 BC. This is not really a surprise, as this is what we would call the golden age of the Minoan world, the height of their culture, wealth, and control over Eastern Mediterranean trade networks as well as the Aegean trade networks, and likely the height of their relationship with the Egyptians. A considerable number of Minoans lived in large, spacious, multi-room houses, many times even having 2 floors built of quality stone and mud brick. These homes were usually clustered together in towns or villages, and even cities either near the seaside or in the countryside among the farms. The closer you traveled from the countryside or seaside villages towards the nearest palace, the more opulent and wealthy the homes would become, as the residents of these homes likely took part in important governmental or sea trading affairs taking place within the palaces or coming in and out of the main ports that were nearby the palaces. They were not necessarily wealthy solely due to inherited wealth or being born of a particular noble-like class, as you see in many other ancient cultures. These wealthier homes were often decorated with elaborate frescoes throughout their walls, almost always depicting the best parts of Minoan life, picking flowers, bird-watching, sailing, creatures you may see while sailing the wine-dark seas, festivals, all the beautiful aspects of Minoan life that were worth immortalizing on your walls. Again, many homes came featured with running water through terracotta piping, sophisticated drainage systems for flushing toilets, and some toilets even being made entirely out of polished marble. The many windows installed along the sides of the home were built for ventilation and lighting, but were also complete with either cloth shades or even wooden shutters, along with paved floors for residents to be able to walk their homes barefooted, and spacious storage facilities for storing grain, wine, and other goods that the residents either purchased in the marketplace or grew themselves out in the country. Minoans were spoiled with a rich diet that most ancient people around the Mediterranean world would have literally killed for. Every meal would have had its serving of plant-based food grown on the island, barley and wheat bread, olives and olive oil, figs, grapes, chickpeas, lentils, lettuce, celery, and asparagus were common, deliciously prepared and eaten regularly. If you lived along the coast, you would have rarely had a shortage of fish, octopus, and shellfish to prepare regularly for your dinner. A Minoan living away from the coast would have had access to these meats as well, but for a cost, of course. Sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle were raised and used for their dairy products like cheese, and during festival, many of the large stock animals would be slaughtered and prepared for enormous feasts where the community would gather together, likely within the courtyards of the grand palaces, to participate in games, drink wine, listen and dance to music, and take part in cultural processions. Unfortunately though, other than the surviving art depicting these festivals, we know basically nothing about what took place during these events, other than the fact that they were important and regular occurrences. But we have no idea when or why these took place. There are dark corners of the palace's lower levels near the courtyards where hordes of large jars and containers that would be used for storage were discovered. It wouldn't be a leap of logic to infer that these storage rooms were likely used to continuously supply the festivals with at least bread and wine over the course of possibly a 2 or 3 day event. I often like to imagine someone working as a server during these festivals, walking through the dimly lit storage rooms to grab a jar of wine or a bag of grain to serve during the midday festival. He could probably hear the games like bull jumping being played out in the courtyard, the sound of the crowd roaring and cheering, echoing through the palace halls and down into the storage room. And maybe he's even hurrying to grab the jar of wine and get back outside as to not miss the action he's been waiting months to see. While farmers out in the countryside raised all of the staple crops and animals we just listed, they also commonly raised bees, which made the consumption of honey a common luxury throughout the Minoan world, which, I might add, would be seen as such a luxury throughout the broader ancient world that even Egyptian pharaohs were buried with honey. On Crete, a Minoan farmer would mix honey in the ingredients of almost every meal. He used honey to make sweet sauce for lamb and pork. He used honey to create a sweet glaze for seafood. He used honey to sweeten meat and bean porridge. He even paired honey with goat or sheep cheese as a regular delicacy. He ate fruit dipped in honey. He drank wine with honey and even spread honey across a slide of bread for a snack like we might do today and think nothing of it. A luxury so treasured by Egyptian god-king pharaohs that they buried themselves with jars of honey was a regular delicacy for even the most modest Minoan living out in the countryside. The picture I'm painting here is the Minoan world in many ways was far more grand and opulent than anywhere else throughout the ancient world. The average Minoan when visiting Egypt, and they did visit Egypt quite regularly, would have almost certainly looked upon the average Egyptian as having significantly less personal freedom, opportunity, wealth, and a drastically lower standard of living compared to what they had back home on Crete. Under no normal circumstance would a Minoan commoner ever trade places with an Egyptian commoner, nor anyone from any other Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization. And it's nearly a guarantee that many commoners from around the Mediterranean world would have envied the extremely high standard of living and personal freedom that the Minoans had whenever they got to meet Minoans who came to their country during international festivals. Minoans would have likely felt significantly more advanced and centuries ahead of their neighboring civilizations, including Egypt, Mesopotamia, and mainland Greece. The sophistication of their buildings, often being 3 to 4 floors tall, plumbing, access to fresh water, vast naval superiority, abundant and diverse diet, the structural quality and spaciousness of their homes, their beautiful natural and temperate environment, earthquake-resistant palatial and residential architecture, their relaxed social norms that praised the physical prowess of fit men and the curvy beauty of women. They had some of the finest taste in fashion found anywhere in the ancient world, where women wore dresses that make modern men feel like they were born in the wrong millennia. And all indications point towards the probable reality that Minoans had a large amount of time to participate in leisurely activities, whether that be parties, festivals, fishing, hunting, sailing, religious cult activities, and a variety of sports that we only slightly understand, but possibly a kernel of the culture around these sports led to the establishment of the Olympic Games in mainland Greece nearly 1,000 years later. If you'd like to join me in Greece, where we will walk among the ruins of the ancient Mycenaean capital, along with viewing artifacts from the Minoans and walking through the city of Athens, Delphi, and many other ancient Greek sites, you can join me on a tour of ancient Greece this November. Spots are limited. Click the link on screen or in the description below. There is perhaps nowhere else in the Minoan world that conveys the wealth, grandeur, beauty, and opulence of this lost civilization than the island of Thera, and on it, the buried city of Akrotiri. The circular island of Thera, known today as Santorini, was a key island for controlling trade throughout the Aegean Sea or the Greek Isles. Where the main island of Crete controlled much of the trade throughout the eastern Mediterranean, Thera controlled trade from Crete into the rest of the Aegean and the Aegean back to Crete. By 2000 BC, around 1,000 years after Minoan culture had emerged on the main island of Crete around 3100 BC, the settlement on the island of Thera that we call Akrotiri had grown substantially. The people living in it embraced and were becoming a vital part of the larger Minoan culture and world. There is a significant amount of archaeological evidence showing that Akrotiri played a massive role in the trading and working of copper between 2500 and 2000 BC. And they were distributing that copper to Crete, Cyprus, and mainland Greece, and possibly even Egypt and Mesopotamia. It was their ability to excel in the copper trade and provide safe harbor for travelers and merchant ships passing through the main routes of the lower Aegean that allowed Akrotiri to amass such significant amounts of wealth that led to the rapid expansion of their city sometime after 2000 BC. Between 2000 and 1600 BC, Akrotiri had solidified itself as the center of copper trade and copper working in the Greek world. It had also evolved into a redistribution center for fine goods like bronze tools, olive oil, wine, honey, fine pottery, and various other expensive goods. The fashioning and trading of copper and bronze into Crete was particularly prosperous, as while Crete was extremely rich in most resources, it lacked local metals on the island and needed Akrotiri to supply them. Again, you can imagine how lucrative that deal must have been for the city of Akrotiri. By 1700 BC, Akrotiri had grown into one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated cities across the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean. Neither Egypt nor Mesopotamia had a single city that was as prosperous, well-built, clean, complete with paved streets, private bathtubs, public access to running fresh water, indoor toilets, drainage systems, a centralized sewage system, 3-story residential buildings complete with balconies, staircases, and large windows for lighting and ventilation. Ceramic pipes ran beneath the city's paved streets, underground channels connecting each of the city's residents' homes and using gravity to lead the waste away from the city. They were even the world's first people to be able to choose between cold and hot running water. The architects of the city had developed a running water network beneath the city that was connected to 2 different springs. One cold and the other was a spring heated by the island's volcano. And in some homes, large cut stone bathtubs were connected directly to these pipes. One can imagine a beautiful Minoan woman of Akrotiri, of which the Minoan culture clearly celebrated their beautiful and well-fashioned women, having a spa for herself in a private bath with hot running water. As she sipped her wine from a finely painted cup and the steam rose up into the room, above her would have been elegant paintings of the best parts of Minoan life or depictions of creatures from their cultural mythology. Her bath would probably be decorated and scented with flowers such as Thera's iconic saffron flower, depicted many times in the art of Akrotiri, and from these paintings we know that saffron was used in perfumes worn in women's hair and used as decoration. And this would have been a woman who, while yes, she was wealthy given the fact that she was a Minoan living in Akrotiri, she was not born into a royal or noble family. Akrotiri was a consumer society where vast amounts of wealth were brought into the city in exchange for the valuable resources, its safe harbors for travelers to dock for a short period of time, and the numerous guest suites built to house international travelers during their stay in Akrotiri. So while she may have been born into a wealthy family, her wealth did not come inherently from the fact that she is royal. This city was unequivocally the Bronze Age Atlantis. In 1650 BC, there may have not been a single other ancient city existing anywhere across the entire planet that surpassed the level of wealth, freedom, and luxury that was possible on Akrotiri. Sometime around 1550 BC or the mid-16th century BC, a series of immense earthquakes struck the island of Thera. Although the city was well built and some of the buildings still stand today, a significant portion of the city's infrastructure collapsed or became unusable. We don't know how long this period of seismic activity was or how much time passed between earthquakes. Some estimates range between 6 to 8 months and others up to 20 to 30 years of seismic activity. However long this period was, though, the people of Akrotiri had enough time to clear the fallen debris and make repairs to the city's infrastructure. Most likely, it was at least over the course of a few years. And finally, a series of intense tremors likely began. Tremors so continuous and so severe that the people of Akrotiri had no choice but to completely shut down their city's activities, pack all of their necessary goods, valuable items, escort their elderly, escort their children, and even pets and farm animals animals onto their ships and flee somewhere out into the greater Minoan world as refugees from what they must have known was an impending natural disaster. And we know nearly without a shadow of a doubt that they successfully evacuated all men, women, children, elderly, pets, and even stock animals out of the city because no skeletal remains have ever been found in Akrotiri. The Minoans, being as sophisticated and well-planned as they were, effectively and successfully evacuated every living thing from the island. Then the fourth largest volcanic eruption in the known history of planet Earth began. The island of Thera exploded. Ash, pumice, hot gas, and debris rose in a towering 20-mile-high column above the Aegean Sea. The volcanic plume was more than 3 times the height of Mount Everest. A black cloud of volcanic glass shards floated across the Aegean and Mediterranean, spreading as far north as the Black Sea and even looming over and raining on Cyprus and Egypt. In fact, scholars debate over whether or not the event was so widespread that even the Egyptians recorded it. There was a stela erected at the temple of Karnak early in the reign of Pharaoh Ahmose I, who was the founder of Egypt's 18th dynasty, sometime around 1550 BC or the middle part of the 16th century BC. It's here that Ahmose describes himself as personally witnessing a catastrophic storm that brought continuous rainfall and darkness, with a sound that was quote-unquote louder than the cries of the masses. This event caused tombs, temples, and pyramids to be damaged, the crude houses of Egyptian commoners collapsed, and bodies floated down the Nile like quote-unquote skiffs of papyrus. This is, of course, a widely debated theory, but it all falls within the same century, and the catastrophes certainly have their similarities. I should also add that some older Egyptologists even proposed the possibility that Thera's eruption was the catalyst that started the plagues of the biblical Exodus, especially the total darkness that covered Egypt. By the end of the first day back on Thera, fine white pumice and ash had started raining down on the city of Akrotiri, quickly burying the city along with nearly the entire island beneath several feet of ash and pumice. And within several more hours, Akrotiri was completely buried beneath more than 20 feet of volcanic debris. By the next day, water from the sea was flowing into the gaping hole that had been blown out of the island, causing massive, violent, steam-driven explosions that pushed hot ash and scorching gas clouds over the island at nearly 200 miles per hour. The few structures that hadn't been entirely buried by debris in the day before suffered major destruction from these bursts. Shortly afterwards, hot avalanches of ash and rock began to pour down the island's slope, crashing into the city and collapsing many of its buildings. Over the course of possibly 72 hours, the great city of Akrotiri, possibly the finest ancient city on the entire planet during its height, had been buried and crushed beneath more than 20 feet and around 100,000 tons of volcanic debris. When the volcano at the center of the island finally collapsed into itself, the force of the seismic activity sent shockwaves through the seas, which sent massive tsunamis more than 90 feet tall crashing into the coastlines of Crete some 85 miles south. The coastal harbors were smashed, boats rose up and over the land, eventually crashing into the hills. Evidence at the site of Malea shows clear evidence that the waves were reaching up to 500 yards inland. Many buildings were partly destroyed, docks were swept away, entire fleets of ships were picked up and thrown inland. The Minoans' Mediterranean and Aegean naval trade was significantly damaged, and refugees from Akrotiri had been dumped into cities that were just now erupting into chaos. And there's a huge archaeological mystery here. Actually, one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of all time. In the early 1900s, when Minoan archaeology began, archaeologists began realizing that across the entire island of Crete, every huge palace and all 50 to 60 cities or so across the entire island had been burned at the same time. For decades, archaeologists were not quite sure what caused this complete and total burning of Minoan civilization on Crete. But in 1967, when modern archaeologists finally followed up on the strange discovery made when construction began on the Suez Canal 100 years earlier, when the workers needed material to use as a cement for the canal, one of the best places for them to harvest volcanic material were the absolutely enormous deposits of ash and pumice covering nearly the entire island of Santorini. When they began quarrying away the ash and pumice, that is when they first uncovered the stone walls of a grand and long buried city, Akrotiri. When excavations began in the late 1960s and they realized that this long buried city was culturally connected to what was now a well-established Minoan culture along the island of Crete, archaeologists began theorizing that if this Minoan city had been completely and utterly buried by this volcano, then perhaps the debris raining down on Crete from the volcano had caused light but widespread burning, as the entire island was covered with a thin burn layer. Another theory posed is that the darkness that must have set upon the island for some 2 or 3 days following Thera's eruption caused widespread chaos and pandemonium, and the Minoan people of Crete accidentally set fire to their own cities from the extraordinary amount of candles and torches that must have been lit, along with the confusion and violence that must come with natural disasters. But according to the most recent and up-to-date research, neither of those theories are accurate. And actually, the widespread burning on Crete seems to have occurred some 150 years later, around 1450 BC, rather than immediately upon Thera's eruption around 1550 to 1600 BC. But that's about all we know for certain. Like I've said before, dating an ancient site or an ancient artifact is much, much easier than figuring out the context of the ancient site or artifact. So, by 1400 BC, only one palace, the largest palace, Knossos, was rebuilt and still in active use. But the art style was different. The pottery was different. The cultural identity of the area itself had changed. Even the official language had changed. The original Minoan language that we identify as Linear A had now been exchanged for a language we identify as Linear B. And Linear B is a language that we can identify as coming from mainland Greece, specifically from the Minoans' main rival, the Mycenaeans, whom you may remember from the movie Troy, with Agamemnon being the king of the Mycenaeans. But all of the events that we've talked about in this video actually took place some 300 to 900 years before the Trojan War. It's not actually known if the Mycenaeans really planned an all-out assault and invasion of the Minoan mainland, deliberately burning down every palace and city. But if that really did happen, it had to be one of the most enormous and dramatic invasions of all time, on a much, 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 much larger scale than the invasion of Troy. Troy was actually a small settlement that controlled access to the Black Sea. The Minoans were a naval empire that controlled trade in and out of the Aegean and much of the trade across the eastern Mediterranean. And with that said, it isn't hard to imagine that the eruption of Thera massively disrupted the naval supremacy of the Minoans across the Aegean, allowing the Mycenaeans' power to dramatically increase over the next 150 years, while Minoan civilization slipped in power until they were finally invaded. Either way, by the fall of Bronze Age civilization around 1100 BC, Minoan culture itself had been completely snuffed out and absorbed by the Mycenaean Empire. Essentially what I'm saying is, all of the people with Minoan ancestry living on Crete 300 years after the Mycenaeans had taken over were now essentially fully Mycenaean themselves. Minoan culture and civilization had disappeared before the Bronze Age even collapsed, and by the time the Mediterranean world had rebuilt itself and new Greek civilizations like Sparta and Athens emerged, the Minoans were a long distant memory of a once great and semi-mythical ancient civilization, of which, even though we may never know the details that survived, a kernel of this great story was passed down and perhaps, at least in part, inspired Plato to tell his students the story of Atlantis. If you'd like to join me in Greece, where we will walk among the ruins of the ancient Mycenaean capital, along with viewing artifacts from the Minoans and walking through the city of Athens, Delphi, and many other ancient Greek sites, you can join me on a tour of ancient Greece this November. Spots are limited. Click the link on screen or in the description below. Let me know if you guys would like to see a full video explaining my point of view and my own version of the Minoan Atlantis theory and how Minoan civilization, probably at least in part, inspired Plato to tell the story of Atlantis. I'm Luke Caverns. Like and subscribe for more lost history of the ancient world, and I'll see you next time.